Mr. Brown, then Ms. Lopez, then Mr. Becerra. Mr. Brown?
Pat, let the record show that Tom Zuckerman and Randy Fiorini agree.
It's good for both of you. Ms. Lopez.
I got up twice today.
Pull that mic up just a little bit. Thank you.
Is that better?
I think so.
Just going off some of the comments that were made about what really is reducing reliance. Again, I've said this before, for upstream agencies, it is our only source. And we're already doing recycling. We don't have a lot of the alternative options in other regions. So when you say reduce reliance, it causes us concern because we are complying with existing laws such as 20% by 2020. But beyond that, it's difficult because you can only reduce so much when it's your only source. Similar to the plight of some of the comments from in the in-delta. There's only so much you can do, and that's the same plight in the upstream area. I also noticed that in the change of language, it went from covered action to proposed action. And just wanted to note that a lot of the comments that you receive from some of the upstream agency is that covered action, to be very clear within this language, that, again, following the statute's definition of covered action, anything outside of the zones that are part of the covered action, that these would not apply. That is not to say that if you're not part of that zone, you can do whatever you want. But again, we already have practices and precedents in place that demonstrate that we are doing the things that are
Ms. Lopez, I think that phrase was pursuant to the consistency section of the statute, which says a state or local public agency that proposes to undertake a covered action. I don't believe it was a new definition. Mr. Stevens?
No, it wasn't a new definition, June. It was kind of, we were trying to lay out the process when we had the screening criteria, so it was an attempt to add clarity to help stakeholders figure out whether or not they're what we were calling proposed actions, and by that we meant actions that met all of the other screening criteria. They were in the geographic boundaries, they were going to be funded by a state agency, they had a significant impact. Then you had to look to the Delta Plan itself to see if a policy covered that proposed action, to turn it into a covered action. So it's kind of complicated. We were trying to add clarity. We're not trying to pull a fast one here. The policies still covered actions, but it's to help people walk through the process to determine whether or not their actions are even covered actions.
And just as we repeat ourselves in different chapters, to be very clear, it may be helpful here again just to note that, so it's very specific, because years down the road...
You want us to repeat once again that no action contained entirely within the area north of the Delta or east of the Delta that has no connection with the Delta should ever be thought of as having a connection with the Delta?
Not those words exactly. We've already provided...
But that intent?
Not exactly, because I think, as everyone said, we're all in this together, but I think clarity is important. And so we proposed some language along with other agencies about what we would like to see added to this particular section. So there's no doubt that it's very clear. So that would be very much appreciated. And comment from DWR, we agree with that, is that anything that gets into adding additional layer or additional process to water rights proceeding, that can be very troublesome. And even though, like I said, we're out of the covered action zone, but just in principle, adding additional element to water rights proceeding, again, as previous commenters have stated, it goes against what's very clearly outlined in the statute that says nothing in this plan will modify or change existing water rights procedure. So just wanted to note that, and that we agree with DWR's comment. The other part is the water supply reliability element. It talks about having that in multiple plans, the Urban Water Management Plan, the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan. And again, here DWR notes that the boundaries are different depending on which plan you're talking about. And we support East Bay Mud's comment that whatever guidelines, that should come from DWR, not from the individual agencies, because they need to reconcile some of the conflicting points. There are some agencies and areas that are not even part of the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan. So those are the kinds of things that need to be first figured out before agencies are required to add additional portion to plans that we're currently part of. To the point of catastrophic part of the water supply element, I'm struggling a little bit with how that applies to upstream agencies, because a catastrophic event in the Delta, well, that's south of us. So when you want us to develop ideas about how would you anticipate or how would you prepare for a catastrophic event of X amount of months, not really sure where we go with that. We know under the Urban Water Management Plan what's required, and we follow those. And we also recognize that not all the measures that will get us to complete efficiency, if it's not cost effective locally, well, those are some of the things that we can't do. So we do address that in the Urban Water Management Plan. So I'm not really sure exactly how that would apply to upstream agency. And the thing about the rate structure, there's variety of rate structures, and it's sort of in the eyes of the beholder. In some areas, as I've said, water budget really works well. In some areas, they get a lot of flack because residents feel that now you have water agencies telling them what to do. And there are several agencies that are in the midst of this battle trying to get their customers to understand, trying to meet the goals. And there's different types of conservation-based rates. And even the California Public Utilities Commission, they're trying to determine exactly how much of conservation is attributed to rate structure. Because right now it's an anecdotal information that they really don't have the actual quantifying data to show them. They're working on that because they really want to establish that relationship. And last point, I know that the council wants to be bold and aggressive and wants to be effective. And you don't have to do that through necessarily languages in the Delta Plan, but I believe you can do more of that going forward once you adopt a plan, because that's the first big hurdle. After that, working with the stakeholders and your governance and making sure that everything is monitored, that the oversight measures are exercised, that's where you can truly be bold and effective, not just because you put specific languages that might cause people to have angst and unnecessary concern right from the get-go.
Let me give you a practical illustration. You're in the mountain county regions, your area, 15 counties that run from pretty close to the Oregon border all the way down to Fresno. You have 17 million acre feet of water that runs through annually, a lot more in wet years, less in dry years. There are currently 500,000 people who live in the county. You currently use 550,000 acre feet of water total, including for urban uses, agriculture, and designated environmental uses. It's less than, according to DWR, less than 2% of the total of all the water that runs through. Isn't it rational for the state of California to consider those facts when it faces the possibility of a catastrophic interruption of the Delta water supply for the remainder of the state? I mean, I assume you're not claiming all 17 million acre feet of water per year, are you?
I can only speak for my county.
Yeah, and you told me before that you wanted to go from, well, I think it was 20,000 acre feet you use now to 40,000, which is fine. But how do you get sense on planning where you say, well, you understand we're up there and we just don't have the same options? Really, people aren't looking at your options. They're looking at the fact that you use less than 2% of the water that goes through the area, but you seem to believe that the water you don't use is somehow unrelated to the state of California.
No, and I would not say that.
Do I misunderstand that?
And if I misspoke, I apologize. But whatever planning that we do, and we do have, obviously, planned growth primarily in ag in our area, we do have that. And we recognize that those would need to fall under existing laws, making sure that we are as efficient as possible. And we are. As I've said, 50% of our water demand is met by recycled water. That's pretty good if you look at the standard. So I think we're doing our part. Where I was unclear is that in the catastrophic event, in this new plan element, you're asking us to develop a plan for what would you do for the next 36 months.
That actually, I don't think it is intended to apply to the mountain counties. It
Okay.
was explicitly intended to say, if you're taking water out of the delta, you need to plan for what happens if this occurs.
And I ask that because it says Delta watershed. It doesn't just say Delta. So
Well,
Delta watershed covers everything, and that was where my confusion came.
Randy?
It could affect urban agencies surrounding Folsom, as an example, because Folsom is part of the watershed, but it's also directly connected in the emergency valve for reestablishing flows and cleaning out the dust. So those agencies really do need to plan for the eventuality of a catastrophic failure, but it doesn't apply to all agencies, and it's hard for me to figure out a way where Calaveras or Tuolumne or Placer would that this would become an important consideration in your planning process.
And
That's
what
why I think it should be a recommendation, not a policy.
And we would appreciate some clarification language to that effect, because assuming that a lot of your recommendation that one day will evolve into policy, and if you're going to require, or DWR will take the responsibility of now requesting us to provide this element within the next urban water management plan, they need to understand that this part would not apply to all the agencies. So that kind of clarification, I think, is important, because if we get hit by a bus tomorrow and the next person picks up the plan and they translate, they might not have this kind of discussion. So that kind of clarification would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next.